hard to even speak after what we've just seen. And the pictures we saw were simply what Hollywood tried to come up with to duplicate, but certainly we can't duplicate what Christ went through. But that's where we are, church. We are on our way to the cross. We've been working our way through the Gospel of John, and by God's good grace, the timing has worked out where we will be looking at His actual death next Sunday and then His resurrection. And the thing I share with you, when we see the cross, and next Sunday will be along the same line, but don't miss the Resurrection Sunday, okay? Don't miss Easter. Because if you miss Easter, you've missed the whole purpose of what we've just seen with our eyes. I mean, this is humanity's darkest hour. Darkest hour. It was so dark that John could not even rehash it again in his mind. Look how John records the crucifixion of Christ. Verse 18. There they crucified Him. That's pretty much what John had to say about the crucifixion. It reminds me, our grandson, John David, has been diagnosed with autism. Many of you know that, and you pray for John David. And John David has a very difficult time looking people in the eye. A part of his struggle is more of a social syndrome. It's a function he struggles when. So when we're talking to him, we'll say, John David, look him in the eye. Because that's a lot, according to what the doctors say, his little brain overstimulates. And so he does not like to look at things that are very intense, like facial expressions can be pretty intense. So he will just look away instead of looking you in the eye. As a matter of fact, David and Katie have pretty much become experts in this area. They've done a lot of research, and they sent Teresa and I a video a few weeks ago of an older man, he's still a young man, who suffers with the same condition that John David has. And they were able to rig something on his head where they were able to see where his eyes focused. And they asked him to watch a scene from a movie that was very intense. The conversation was very intense. A man and a woman were talking in very deep conversation. But they were able to film the focus of this young man's eyes. And as this man and woman were in intense conversation, the camera began to notice that he was focused on the clock in the back of the wall. And he was focused on the light bulb in the corner of the room. And as a matter of fact, his attention in the deepest part of the conversation became focused on the little ball that hung from the on and off switch connected to the light bulb. That's where he focused, because the conversation was so intense. It was too much stimulation for his mind. So that's kind of an escape mechanism that John David has, and we're trying to work with him and help him to learn how to look people in the eye when you talk to them, and to look people in the eye when you're having conversation, because it's too much stimuli. I thought of that when I read this account. It's almost as if John is saying, this is too much for me. This is too much. I can't go through this again. I don't want to describe to you what Jesus went through. And there's a reason that John talks about all the peripheral things. John talks to us about the people who died, the place he went to, the proclamation, the sign over his head, the people who were standing at the cross. John tells us all these things, I believe, because it was so hard to focus once again on the horror of the crucifixion. The crucifixion, according to Cicero, was the most cruel and horrifying death possible. It was a despicable death. No Roman citizen, no matter how vile their crime, would ever be crucified. No Roman citizen would ever be subjected to the horror of crucifixion. So John, and I think in his own way to escape and handle the situation, just doesn't give us the gory details. As a matter of fact, John is the only gospel writer who was actually right there at the cross. Did you know that? The only gospel writer who is actually right there at the cross, and he tells us less about the crucifixion than anybody else. Why? Because it was such a horrible, horrible way to die. Look over in verse 35 of John 19. John does say this, "And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true. And he knows that he is telling the truth so that you also may believe." John is saying, I saw it with my own eyes, and I've recorded these events for a purpose, and that purpose is so that you might believe. Believe what? John 20:31, he says, "So that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in His name." That's why John wrote what he wrote, but it's an interesting account. John gives us the attention, causes his attention to kind of light or dwell on so many things surrounding the cross, but they all are significant. Let's look quickly first at the place He died. Verse 17, "They took Jesus therefore, and He went out, bearing His own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. He went out." The King James says they led Him away. They didn't drag Him. Jesus offered no resistance. Just as Isaiah said, "Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so He did not even open His mouth." Isaiah 53. Jesus had made it very clear. He says, "I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep." So they led Him away, not kicking and screaming, but they took Him as a lamb is silent before the slaughter. They took Him from the place of judgment, which was called Gabbatha, to the place of execution, which is called Golgotha. He went in just a matter of hours. He went out. John gives us no details about Jesus carrying His cross through the city streets. John doesn't tell us about Simon the Cyrene taking the cross of Christ, because Jesus was obviously too weak from having been beaten and all the blood loss that He suffered. But He just went out. And this is significant because He went out of the city to a place called the place of the skull. Exodus chapter 29 verse 14, Leviticus 4 verse 12 tells us very clearly that the sacrifice for sin must be taken outside the camp, outside the city, to be offered as a sin offering. So the place was significant. So significant that the writer of Hebrews reminds us in Hebrews 13:12, "Therefore Jesus also, that He might sanctify the people through His blood, suffered outside the gate." Outside the gate. This place where Jesus went, the place of the skull, was not the place for the normal Jewish execution. I've shared with you that before. The crime that Jesus committed was that of blasphemy. The execution or the punishment for blasphemy is stoning. And the way they did that was inside the city. There was a place that Alfred Edersheim says is called the Beth Hakkalah. The Beth Hakkalah. It was a place in Jerusalem where the victim would be taken. And then they would be pushed off of a cliff into a rocky pit. The cliff, the elevation was maybe 12, 14 feet, and whoever had the accusation against the criminal would come and push their victim off the cliff, and normally they would die when they hit the cliff. But if they didn't die, the second witness would take a stone and would come and cast that stone down upon the victim to ensure their death. And if by some reason they survived that process, then everyone grabbed stones and they would throw stones not up, but down into a pit. Down into a pit. And that's how a Jewish criminal would die. That's the way Jesus would have died had He been turned over to the hands of the Jews to suffer a Jewish execution. But no, the Bible says that He would be lifted up. So they took Him outside the gate. Psalm 22 said, "They pierced my hands and my feet."